Hello, my loves. I'm going to read chapter 13, which is called Bouncing Burke Way. And I think if I remember, it's a really short chapter, so maybe I will read chapter 14 as well, which is called The Rhododendron. And I'll explain about that in a minute. Chapter 13, Bouncing Burke Way. It was time to tell Graham and Gramps about Mr. Burke. Mr. Burke was mighty strange. I didn't know what to make of him. I thought he might have a few squirrels in the attic of his brain. He was one of those energetic teachers who loved his subject half to death and leaped about the room dramatically, waving his arms and clutching his chest and whomping people on the back. He said brilliant and wonderful and terrific. He was tall and slim, and his bushy black hair made him look wild, but he had enormous, deep, brown, cow-like eyes that sparkled all over the place, and when he turned these eyes on you, you felt as if his whole purpose in life was to stand there and listen to you and you alone. Midway through the first class, Mr. Burke asked for everyone's summer journals. He flung himself up and down the aisles, receiving the journals as if they were manna from heaven. Wonderful, he said to each journal giver. I was worried. I had no journal. On top of Mary Lou Finney's desk were 6 journals. 6. Mr. Burke said, Heavens, mercy, is it? Can it be? Shakespeare. He counted the journals. 1, 2, 6. Brilliant. Magnificent. Christy and Megan, 2 girls who had their own club called GCP, whatever that meant, were whispering over on the other side of the room and casting malevolent looks in Mary Lou's direction. Malevolent is a fabulous word, boys and girls. You know the word. If you've seen the movie Maleficent, see, maleficent, malevolent. And if you speak Spanish and you know malo, bad, malevolent means truly evil. So they were casting malevolent looks in Mary Lou's direction. Mary Lou kept her hand on top of the journals as Mr. Burke reached for them. In a low voice, she said, I don't want you to read them. What? Mr. Burke boomed. Not read them? The whole room was silent. Mr. Burke scooped up Mary Lou's journals before she could even blink. He said, Don't be silly. Brilliant. Thank you. Another girl, Beth Ann, looked as if she might cry. Phoebe was sending me messages with her eyebrows that indicated she was not too pleased either. I think they were all hoping that Mr. Burke was not actually going to read these journals. Mr. Burke went around the whole room snatching journals. Alex Cheevy's journal was covered with basketball stickers. Christy's and Megan's were slathered over with pictures of male models. The cover of Ben's was a cartoon of a boy with a normal boy's head, but the arms and legs were pencils, and out of the tips of the hands and feet were dribbles of words. That's perfect for Ben, don't you think? Remember his salamander and his freebie ice bottom? When he got to Phoebe's desk, Mr. Burke lifted up her plain journal and peeked inside. Phoebe was trying to slide down in her chair. I didn't write much, Phoebe said. In fact, I can hardly remember what I wrote about it all. By the time Mr. Burke got to me, my heart was clobbering around so hard I thought it might leap straight out of my chest. Deprived child, he said. You didn't even have a chance to write a journal. I'm new. New? How blessed, he said. There's nothing in this whole wide world that is better than a new person. So I didn't know about the journals. Not to worry, Mr. Burke said. I'll think of something. I wasn't sure what that meant. I thought maybe he would give me a whole lot of extra homework or something. For the rest of the day, you could see little groups of people asking each other, Did you write about me? I was very glad I hadn't written anything. For a while, we didn't hear any more about the journals. We had absolutely no idea all the trouble they were going to cause. And that's the end of Bouncing Burkway, Chapter 13. That's some serious foreshadowing there, boys and girls. We had absolutely no idea all the trouble they were going to cause. You know that something's coming up. All right, Chapter 14 is called The Rhododendron. One Saturday, I was at Phoebe's again. Her father was golfing and her mother was running errands. Mrs. Winterbottom had read out a long list to us of where she would be in case we needed her. If we heard any noises at all, we were supposed to call the police immediately. After you call the police, Mrs. Winterbottom said, call Mrs. Cadaver. I think she's home today. I'm sure she would come right over. Oh, sure, Phoebe whispered to me. That's about the last person I would call. Phoebe imagined that every noise was the lunatic sneaking in or the message leaver creeping up to drop off another anonymous note. She was so jumpy that I began to feel uneasy too. After her mother left, Phoebe said, Mrs. Cadaver works odd hours, doesn't she? Sometimes she works every night for a week, straggling home when most people are waking up, but sometimes she works during the day. She's a nurse, I said, so I guess she works different shifts. That day, Mrs. Cadaver was at home, puttering around in her garden. We saw her from Phoebe's bedroom window. Actually, puttering is not the best word. What she was doing was more like slogging and slashing. Mrs. Cadaver hacked branches off of trees and hauled these to the back of her lot where she lumped them into a pile of branches that she had hacked off last week. I told you, she's as strong as an ox, Phoebe said. Next, Mrs. Cadaver slashed and sliced at a pitiful rose bush that had been trying to creep up the side of her house. Then she sheared off the tops of the hedge that borders Phoebe's yard. She moved on to a rhododendron bush, which she was poking and prodding when a car pulled into her driveway. A tall man with bushy black hair leaped out, and seeing her, he practically skipped back to where she was. They hugged each other. Oh no, Phoebe said. The man with the bushy black hair was Mr. Burkway, our teacher. Mrs. Cadaver pointed to the rhododendron bush and then at the axe, but Mr. Burkway shook his head. He disappeared into the garage and returned with 2 shovels. Then he and Mrs. Cadaver gouged and prodded and tunneled around in the dirt until the poor old rhododendron flopped onto its side. They lugged the bush to the opposite side of the yard where there was a mound of dirt, and they replanted the bush. Boys and girls, I'm going to tell you that rhododendron bush had to have been a tiny one, because I had a rhododendron bush on the side of my house, and it did not take a couple of shovels to get it out. It took a big truck that had to attach itself to it and yank it out, and the roots were everywhere. Whew. So this was a small rhododendron bush, for sure. In any case, maybe there's something hidden under the bush, Phoebe said. Like what? Like Mr. Cadaver, as I told you before. Maybe Mr. Burkway helped her chop up her husband and bury him, and maybe they were getting worried and decided to disguise the spot with a rhododendron bush planted over it. I must have looked skeptical. Phoebe said, Sal, you never can tell. And Sal, I don't think you and your father should go over there anymore. I certainly agreed with her on that one. Dad and I had been there 2 nights earlier, and I had hardly been able to sit still. I started noticing all these frightening things in Margaret's house. Creepy masks, old swords, books with titles like The Murders in Rue Morgue and The Skull and the Hatchet. Margaret had cornered me in the kitchen and said, So, what has your father told you about me? Nothing, I said. Oh, she seemed disappointed. My father's behavior was always different at Margaret's. At home, I would sometimes find him sitting on his bed, staring at the floor, or reading through old letters, or gazing at the photo album. He looked sad and lonely. But at Margaret's, he would smile and sometimes even laugh. And once she touched his hand and he let her hand rest there on top of his. I didn't like it. I didn't want my father to be sad, but at least when he was sad, I knew that he was thinking about my mother. So when Phoebe suggested that my father and I should not go to Margaret's, I was quite willing to agree with that notion. When Phoebe's mother came home from running all her errands, she looked terrible. She was sniffling and blowing her nose. Phoebe said that we were going to do our homework. Upstairs, I said, maybe we should have helped her put away the groceries. She likes to do that all by herself, Phoebe said. Are you sure? Of course I'm sure, Phoebe said. I've lived here my whole life, haven't I? She looked as if she'd been crying. Maybe something's wrong. Maybe something's bothering her. Don't you think she would have said so then? Maybe she's afraid to, I said. I wondered why it was so easy for me to see that Phoebe's mother was worried and miserable, but Phoebe couldn't see it, or if she could, she was ignoring it. Maybe she didn't want to notice. Maybe it was too frightening a thing. I wondered if this was how it had been with my mother. Were there things that I hadn't noticed? Later that afternoon, when Phoebe and I went downstairs, Mrs. Winterbottom was talking with Prudence. Do you think I lead a tiny life? She asked. How do you mean? Prudence said as she filed her nails. Do we have any nail polish remover? Phoebe's mother went and retrieved a bottle of nail polish remover from the bathroom. Oh, Prudence said, before I forget, do you think you could sew up the hem on my brown skirt so that I could wear it tomorrow? Please? Prudence tilted her head to the side, tugged her hair in the same way Phoebe does, and smooshed up her mouth into a tiny little pout. Doesn't Prudence know how to sew? I said. Of course she does, Phoebe said. Why? Well, I was just wondering why she doesn't sew her own skirt. Sal, you're becoming very critical. Before I left Phoebe's that day, Mrs. Winterbottom handed Prudence her brown skirt with the newly sewn hem. And all the way home, I wondered about Mrs. Winterbottom and what she meant about living a tiny life. If she didn't like all that baking and cleaning and jumping up to get bottles of nail polish remover and sewing hems, why did she do it? Why didn't she tell them to do some of these things themselves? Maybe she was afraid that there would be nothing left for her to do. There would be no need for her, and she'd become invisible and no one would even notice. When I got home that day, my father handed me a package. It's from Margaret, he said. What is it? I don't know. Why don't you open it? Inside was a blue sweater. I put it back in the box and went upstairs. My father followed me. Sal, do you like it? I don't want it, I said. She was just trying to. She likes you. I don't care if she likes me or not, I said. My father stood there looking around the room. I want to tell you something about Margaret, he said. Well, I don't want to hear it. I was feeling so completely ornery. When my father left the room, I could still hear my own voice saying, I don't want to hear it. I sounded exactly like Phoebe. That's the end of the Rhododendron. What do you think about the way Prudence responded to her mother asking her, do you think I lead a tiny life? And what do you think that means? And she didn't even consider it. She just immediately blew her off and thought about what she wanted. Nail polish remover. I think if your mother asks you, do I lead a small life, a tiny life? Something is up and you need to pay attention to your mother. Don't you? All right, that's it for today. I will be back tomorrow. Goodbye, my loves. I hope you are staying dry on this rainy, rainy day.